Number 10. Nagoro, Japan. From the outside, this city may seem like any other small riverside village in Japan, but the scariest part of this town is its residents. As you journey through the town, you might see an elderly couple tending to their garden, people shopping at the grocery store, and children attending school. But look closely and you will realize that these people aren't actually people. They are life-size dolls. Only around 20 citizens of the village are actual living, breathing humans, the youngest being over 50 years old. So then why is there a school full of children? 12 plush scarecrows sit at their desks doing homework while being taught by an equally felted teacher. These tableaus are present throughout the entirety of the village, especially in the abandoned and fading buildings, adding a constant creepy aura to the sleepy little town. It began in 2002 when a resident created a scarecrow of her father, and it has only continued to grow since then.
Moving on, at number 9 we have the DUGWAY Proving Ground. Located in Utah, the DUGWAY Proving Ground is the main biological and chemical weapons testing site for the US Army. During 1949 to 1952, 4 major types of radiation weapons tests took place there. First, we got the cluster bombs. Cluster bombs weighed about a ton each and they were dropped from airplanes flying at 20,000 feet. They then would explode when they reached 800 feet above the ground, spreading radioactive particles everywhere. These tests released between 1,500 to 30,000 curies of radiation each. Then we have the small pellet tests. Again, this involved dropping small radioactive pellets over the area from a high altitude. Then we have the radioactive specks. Basically, a dust generator would fly over the area and spew radioactive specks all over that area. They also tested exploding radioactive metal in different shapes to see what would spread the contamination the best. Each test released about 100 curies of radiation.
Number 8. GOMANTONG Caves in Malaysia. This one doesn't come with any horrible tragedy or ghost story, but is instead a terrifying destination for those of us who hate creepy crawlies. When you first enter GOMANTONG Caves in Malaysia, you'll notice a large amount of excrement on the ground. That's because the caves are home to almost 2 million bats that sleep there during the day. When you get further in, the walls and floors seem to be moving. That's because what's left behind by bats attracts millions of cockroaches into the caves. It's almost impossible to take a step without trampling on a few of the creatures, so it's probably a good idea not to wear your favorite shoes if you plan on taking a tour. It doesn't end there though, as the caves are also home to swarms of giant millipedes. So basically it just sounds like somewhere I have absolutely no interest in visiting. But apparently at around 8 PM every night, you can see the bats leaving the cave in what looks like a massive black vortex. So if you're willing to kiss a few cockroaches to be able to see that, well, that's your choice. Number 7. Haw Par Villa in Singapore. This theme park is one of those places that you just can't believe somebody actually thought, hey, this is a good idea, and went ahead with building it. Haw Par Villa in Singapore is an amusement park that is home to mostly creepy and bizarre statues. This place is known as basically the opposite of Disneyland, as it is themed after the underworld, and the main attraction is the 10 Courts of Hell. It was built and intended to teach children about morality, with statues of people being punished for committing certain crimes. I think would be enough to just tell the children that if they sin, they'll have to spend the afterlife at this theme park. Statues include things like animals eating people, half human, half crab creatures, and various other gory tableaus. For those who are fans of the creepy and macabre, this may be a top tier destination spot, but for the rest of us, I think I'll just stick with Disney for now. Number 6. The Stanley Hotel in Colorado. If you're a fan of The Shining, then you're probably already aware of the Stanley Hotel, as this creepy hotel was the basis for the setting of the movie, a visit in 1974 inspiring Stephen King to write the novel, and the pet cemetery on site of the hotel would also serve as inspiration for another book he would write, of course, Pet Sematary. The large estate sitting at the bottom of the Rocky Mountains has a long history, as well as a long history of ghostly hauntings and inexplicable encounters. A ghost tour highlights a lot of the main specters that are said to roam the rooms and halls of the hotel. Stanley himself and his wife Flora apparently remain there, seen within the bar and playing the piano respectively. A few of the rooms are reportedly haunted with specific ghosts. 407 haunted by Lord Dunraven, and 418 is haunted by children who can be heard laughing. Stephen King had stayed within room 217, outside of which a ghost of a young boy is said to appear. The author said he had seen the child himself, and that he was apparently calling out for his nanny. Number 5. Poveglia Island in Italy. Known as Italy's most haunted island and sometimes considered one of the most haunted places in the world, Poveglia Island is home to a long and twisted history. When the bubonic plague was sweeping populations, those who were sick were sent off to Poveglia Island as a sort of quarantine zone, and the same happened when the Black Death was going around. In the late 1800s, an asylum was built on the island. It was poorly constructed and wasn't really used as a place for healing or caring for the sick, but instead as a place of exile for them to be kept away from the rest of the community and to spend the rest of their days. In the 1930s, there was apparently a cruel doctor running the asylum who was responsible for doing unethical experiments on the patients. Eventually, he fell from the bell tower, and while it's long gone, people say that they can still hear the chimes of the bell coming from the island. It is apparently crawling with the ghosts of the many souls who passed away there over the centuries. If you want to check it out for yourself though, you may find it quite difficult, as Italy prevents any tourists from visiting the island, and there is a lengthy application process to even be considered. Number 4. Tronquil Sanatorium in Kamloops, British Columbia. Going up to the Great White North, Tronquil Sanatorium in British Columbia is known as one of the most haunted places in Canada. It was built in 1907 to treat people who were suffering from tuberculosis. It operated this way for many decades until it eventually closed its doors in 1958, as anti-tuberculosis medicine came around in 1940. It became a mental health institution before later becoming a detention facility for young offenders. As with Poveglia, the history of disease and death has led many to believe that the facility and grounds are incredibly haunted, and many people have reported large amounts of paranormal experiences. There are apparently various different ghosts you can spot there, like a mother crying for her child or the sound of children playing. And many people have shared photos from the facility where you can see ghost orbs or the outlines of figures in the dark. One of the main highlights, however, is the tunnels underneath, which were used for transportation and are apparently incredibly haunted. If you're interested, the farm that is now on the property offers tours and even escape rooms. Number 3. HOIA BACIU Forest in Romania. Known as one of the most haunted forests in the world, HOIA BACIU is known as the Bermuda Triangle of Romania. The first thing that you'll notice when looking at pictures of the forest are the trees that appear crooked and bent, looking like they're contorting and reaching out for something. There are many legends surrounding the forest, most to do with ghostly and paranormal sightings. There's one story of a girl who disappeared into the forest, only to reappear 5 years later with no memory of what had happened or where she had been. She was wearing the same clothing and apparently hadn't aged at all. There's also another story about a sheep herder and his entire flock of 200 sheep which vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Those who do enter the forest and make it back out find themselves with mysterious headaches, rashes, and burns with no known explanation. And you know I can't make it through a list without mentioning aliens, so yes, there have been numerous reports of UFOs and extraterrestrials residing within the forest. Number 2. The Paris Catacombs. Claustrophobic underground tunnels filled with 6 million bodies? Of course it's haunted. The Paris Catacombs were created in the 18th century when the cemeteries were becoming overcrowded and they needed to find a quick solution. The 200 miles of tunnels lined with skeletons are home to plenty of ghost stories, legends, and petrifying encounters. One of the most famous stories comes from the 1990s when a group was exploring the dark tunnels and they found an abandoned camera. It had footage on it, and when they played it, they were disturbed to find footage of a man who was clearly lost, running through the catacombs before he eventually drops the camera. Nobody knows what happened to the man or where he ended up. It's also said that if you're there after midnight, the walls will start to speak to you, dismembered voices urging you to venture deeper and deeper into the tomb until you're no longer able to find your way out. Number 1. The Island of the Dolls. In the mid-20th century, a man named Don Julian left his wife to live alone on an island on a lake in Mexico. Shortly after he had moved there, he discovered the body of a girl in the river, followed by a doll floating by. He took the doll and hung it from a tree in an attempt to appease the girl's spirit, but apparently it wasn't enough. For the next 50 years, he would collect dolls from the trash and canals and hang them from all the trees on the island. The dolls and toys are all in various states of disrepair, some completely falling apart, making it one of the creepiest islands on Earth. In 2001, Don Julian himself passed away, his body being discovered in the river. The dolls that still remain on this island to this day are supposedly haunted, there being many reports of their eyes moving to look at you, their arms moving as though to reach out to you, and apparently whispering to each other in the night. If the photos of the island aren't enough to scare you away, you can get onto the island for yourself for just around $2 a person. But once again, I'll leave the exploration up to you guys.
Starting us off at number 10, we have the beautiful red fox. Since the devastating events of the Chernobyl explosion back in 1986, the exclusion zone has pretty much become a ghost town. But only for humans. As far as wildlife is concerned, this place is booming like Vegas on a Friday night. One of the most often seen animals there is the highly adaptable red fox. Red foxes are known to thrive in many different kinds of environments, from urban and rural areas from Canada all the way to Australia, and Chernobyl is no exception. The red fox is not exactly accustomed to humans, especially near Chernobyl, so most of these foxes are not actually scared of the tourists that do explore the exclusion zone every year. Many visitors report that these foxes actually approach them hoping for a little treat. Now, how sweet is that? In a previous video, I don't hold back my fear of the piles of old dolls that also inhabit Chernobyl, but if I have the chance to get close to a red fox and maybe become best friends with it, I might just have to go. But what's actually weird about it? Well, there's nothing that will stick out more in a 35-year-old ghost town of one of the biggest radiation blasts ever than a beautiful red fox. The dolls make sense to me. The foxes, they need to relocate to like my backyard where I can feed them and love them forever because crikey, I love wildlife.
Number 9. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Forget Hunger Games: The Girl on Fire, Centralia, Pennsylvania is the city on fire. This ghost town in the United States used to have thousands of residents and had a booming economy and infrastructure thanks to the lengthy coal mines around and underneath the town. In the 60s, however, they discovered they had an issue with illegal dumping and built a massive landfill, and eventually it came time to burn it out. What they didn't realize, however, was that there was a hole connected to the mines at the bottom of the garbage, and the fire quickly spread to the coal mines beneath the town. They didn't realize it until smoke started billowing out of the ground, and they discovered that there was no way to put the fire out. Residents were forced out of the town as the fire was causing people to pass out in their homes, and massive sinkholes were opening up in the ground. Some people fought to stay, however, and the once bustling town now has only about 5 residents. To this day, the fires are still burning, and the coal underground could allow the town to burn for another 250 years.
At number 8, we have the cousin of the radioactive elk, the radioactive deer. Back in 1986, during the Chernobyl blast, most of Western Russia and Europe was blanketed by a toxic cloud. That toxic cloud reached all the way out to Norway and impacted the wildlife there almost as much as it did in the Ukraine. In central and southern Norway, the migratory reindeer often feed on lichen and fungus, 2 foods of the reindeer that were exposed to large amounts of radiation from that toxic cloud. These reindeer now contain higher levels of radioactivity that are beyond the European Union limit for consumption, which is a huge problem for the indigenous people of the area, known as the Sami. The Sami heavily rely on the reindeer for being one of their best sources of food, and yet for the first time ever, they're being told it is not safe to eat some of these animals. Just days after the blast in 1986, the government tested the radiation in the reindeer and measured anywhere between 30,000 to 60,000 becquerel per kilogram. This forced authorities to raise the limit of acceptable radiation found in animals from 600 becquerel per kilogram to 3,000, so the Samis still had enough food sources to sustain them. Lavrent Skutterud, an environmental radiation expert of the Norway Radiation Protection Authority, says it is important to remember that the permissible levels are not toxic limits. The limits are instead intended to minimize the amount of radiated food people consume every year, generally trying to keep it below 80,000 a year. The levels of radiation have fallen over the years, and there are still spikes from time to time. While these reindeer were studied in Norway and not exactly Chernobyl, deer are abundant in the exclusion zone and are known to migrate far distances. So, from Chernobyl all the way to Norway, you can find large numbers of radioactive deer. That sounds weird. Coming in at number 7, we have brightly colored birds. That's right, bright colored little birds. Creepy, am I right? Now, okay, I know this one is a little vague, but let me tell you why it's specifically these birds. Professor Timothy Mousseau and Dr. Anders Moller studied 1,570 birds in the forests and surrounding areas of Chernobyl. They found that the populations of birds that were colored red, orange, and yellow, such as the yellowhammer, have decreased more than those of larger and less vibrant colors. The reason being? Antioxidants and carotenoids. Birds that produce carotenoids have brighter colors. Producing those bright colors, laying large eggs, and migrating large distances uses up a large amount of antioxidants in the bird's body, making them more susceptible to higher levels of radiation and decreasing their populations. Among the species that were most impacted are orioles, blackbirds, quails, hoopoes, and robins. I was really hoping the radiation was the reason these birds were bright colored, and that maybe there's a tie-dye oriole out there or something, but I'm afraid I'm out of luck. Staying with the bird theme, coming in at number 6 is the white-tailed eagle. Unlike the small, colorful, radioactive birds, the endangered white-tailed eagle is thriving in the Ukraine. University of Georgia researchers completed a month-long camera study laying dead fish carcasses near the riverbeds of the exclusion zone to see what kinds and how many different predator species would come and feed off the dead fish. James Beasley of Savannah River Ecology Laboratory said, "We've seen evidence of a diversity of wildlife in the CEZ through our previous research, but this is the first time that we've seen white-tailed eagles, American mink, and river otter on our cameras. Imagine watching an endangered species come flocking back in large numbers to feed in only one area. Hey, maybe radioactive fish just tastes a bit better. As much as I love seafood though, I think I'm just gonna leave it for the eagles." Coming in at our halfway point, number 5, we have the European brown bear. Reported back in 2014 for the first time in 100 years, a brown bear was seen in the exclusion zone of Chernobyl. A Ukrainian collaborator for the Transfer Exposure Effects Research Program by the name of Sergei Gaschek set up cameras hoping to learn more about the effects of the radioactivity in the area when all of a sudden one night on camera, a brown bear decided to make its big entrance back into Chernobyl. Brown bears are not the first large mammal to be seen in the exclusion zone, but it is definitely something to celebrate after a brown bear pieces out of there 100 years ago. Project leader Mike Woods from the University of Salford reported that, "We are basically working on the assumption that as you move people out of the equation and human pressure and disturbance is removed, then any animals that have a corridor into the exclusion zone find they are suddenly away from the pressures and dangers presented by people." So basically, this radioactive ghost town is a heaven on earth for all of our large furry friends. But hey, as long as you got the bare necessities, who cares what it looks like? I wonder if our buddy Bigfoot ever vacations there. At number 4, going down in size from the European brown bear, we have firebugs. Little radioactive bugs who spontaneously combust and fly around the Ukraine terrorizing people. It's mayhem! Just kidding. Sadly, it's not as cool as that. Sorry. Back in April of 2011, our good friends Anders Moller and Timothy Mousseau were collecting flowers in the famous Red Forest to study their pollen when they came across these little firebugs. They collected a few hundred of these little bugs and compared the markings on bugs from places of higher radiation to those of places of lower radiation. The result? Firebugs from higher radiation spots tended to have missing or deformed markings on them, such as missing dots or eyes, as some others call them. There you have it. What happens when a bug becomes radioactive? It loses a spot. Wow. Starting us off in our top 3 is arguably the most intelligent mammal on Earth. Humans! That's right, we are technically animals, and you can find humans in the exclusion zone almost every day of the year. In one of my previous videos, I told you all that there are actual tours to the Chernobyl site, and around 12,000 tourists visit the site every year. That's 32.8767123 people a day, because that makes sense. From 2014 to 2018, Meredith Yeager, the team leader of the US National Cancer Institute, sequenced the genomes of 130 children that were conceived after the 1986 disaster. They looked at children born from 1987 to 2002, as well as the genomes of the children's parents, with at least one of the parents being exposed to and within 45 miles of the 1986 blast. While the tests proved that the children of Chernobyl survivors and witnesses didn't carry more genetic mutations, some of those originally exposed did develop thyroid cancers. Studies found that more radiation exposed and the younger the person was increased the chances of developing the cancer. But of course, nowadays radioactive levels are much lower and measurements are taken with a dosimeter every single day to verify the safety for human exploration. So, if you want to go to Chernobyl or already have been, please let me know what it was like down in the comments. Coming in at number 2 is a real weird one. A giant catfish. Seriously. Over in Chernobyl's cooling pond, giant catfish can be seen swimming and even the odd time caught by adventurous fishermen. Back in 2016, a video surfaced of the massive aquatic animal in Chernobyl's cooling pond, and sure enough, many people thought it to be some kind of mutated monster fish. But whether we wish it was or not, radiation is not the reason for its massive size. The Wells catfish is a species known to reach gargantuan size. Some of these fish can reach up to 800 pounds, but are extremely rare due to the fact that most of the time they are mistaken for beluga sturgeon, or just exaggerated. It is entirely possible for these creatures to reach up to 350 pounds though, and that is still a massive fish to me. Italian fisherman Dino Ferrari caught one back in May of 2016, and this thing looks crazy. In the cooling ponds of Chernobyl, there is no real competition or higher predators of this giant fish, so it has more than enough food available to keep them packing on those gains and stay well fed. I never thought I would say this, but I think I'm scared of a catfish. Finally, coming in at our number 1 spot is definitely the weirdest animal on there. It's the raccoon dog. These half raccoon, half dog looking animals are a topic of controversy with some authorities, arguing if it is a member of the dog family or a member of the raccoon family, or the much more scientific name for it, part of the Procyon family. Yeah, raccoon sounds better. These crazy interesting animals are native to Eastern Asia, as well as quite common in the exclusion zone of Chernobyl. Once again, this is not a really cool radioactive combination of a raccoon and a dog, but just another animal that isn't exactly sure which family it is a part of. In a study completed by the ecologist James Beasley, it was discovered that raccoon dogs were just one of the many species of mammals that are thriving in the exclusion zone. He even got his picture taken with one, and I gotta say, it's so fluffy! For the longest time, I really wanted to get a dog and I didn't care what breed it was, but now, I think I want a raccoon dog.
Starting off this countdown, we have Fukushima. Due to the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Japan is said to be one of the world's most radioactive places. In 2011, an earthquake triggered a tsunami that ended up flooding the nuclear power plant and knocking out emergency generators. The power plant survived the earthquake, but the tsunami was twice as powerful as the plant was designed to tolerate. It led to the plant's 3 reactors leaking radioactive materials everywhere. The material contaminated wastewater and leaked into the Pacific Ocean. As a result, this is considered the most severe nuclear accident since Chernobyl. To this day, people are still cleaning up the nuclear waste and contaminated water there. In fact, 1.25 million tons of radioactive water is currently being stored at Fukushima. What's scary is that next year they won't be able to store it anymore, so they're looking at releasing it into the sea. Obviously, it will be treated first, but still, it won't be good for the marine life or the water.
At number 9, we have elk. Back in 2018, tourists spotted this large creature in a water tank at Chernobyl, and no, it wasn't a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. It was a poor, stranded, full-size elk. As far as its age and its ninja skills, that is unknown. This large and beautiful creature somehow fell into the water tanks between the 5th and the 6th reactors and was reportedly stuck in the radioactive water for 3 days. Tourists called the local fire department to come and help save the poor animal. One firefighter tethered a rope to its antlers so that while being towed by the boat back to safety, the animal could keep its head above water. The entire rescue took about an hour before the elk was brought up onto the bank, where it then rested for about 4 hours before finally making its way back to the forest for some much needed R&R. No one quite knows how it got in the tank, but many believe it was running away from wolves or some other type of predator and accidentally fell into the tank after. A local radiation expert, Denis Wisniewski, said the radiation dose it had would not be fatal. The elk will survive in spite of taking a big radiation dose. If you ask me, this sounds like the birth of a superhero, you know? Like the wolves chase the elk falls into a radioactive river, it resubmerges with radioactive superpowers, and then it seeks out its revenge on the wolves? Come on, it writes itself. Joking aside, bless the hearts of everyone involved saving that poor animal. But I would be on the lookout for mutated elk out there, because after swimming in radioactive water for 3 days, dang, that's gotta do something.
In our 8th spot today, we have the abandoned hospital in Brazil. Now we'll be talking about an abandoned hospital site in Brazil that used to perform radiation therapy for cancer patients. On September 13th in 1987, a bunch of individuals broke into the abandoned hospital and stole some parts from a teletherapy unit, thinking it would be worth some money. Little did they know that they took home something highly radioactive. That night, upon bringing it home, the 2 men became very sick and threw up. In the following days, the 2 men became worse and worse. One of the men actually had his hand swell and he had to get it partially amputated. Little did they know what was causing this. While this was all happening, they gave this radioactive piece of equipment to a number of different people. In fact, one of the guys even dismantled it, spreading cesium all over a large area. In the end, 4 people died as a result of this incident and 250 others were injured from exposure to radioactive contamination. A cleanup crew was sent to decontaminate the area. Topsoil was removed in several areas and a number of houses were demolished. To this day, it's said to be one of the world's worst nuclear disasters and one of the world's worst radiological incident. In our 7th spot, we have Hanford site. Located in Washington, D.C., the Hanford site is said to be one of the world's most radioactive places. So during the Cold War, the US used this site as its main plutonium production facility for their nuclear weapons. In the end, they produced enough plutonium for around 60,000 nuclear weapons, including the plutonium that was used in the Fat Man bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki in 1945. Now this place has since been decommissioned, but still contains about 60% of high-level radioactive waste. Most of the waste has been buried underground, but that wasn't a good decision because large areas of groundwater have since become contaminated. Coming in at number 6, we have d'Aubervilliers, Paris. During the 1920s to 1930s, 2 individuals, Frederick and Irene Joliet Curie, conducted a number of studies on radioactivity in this area. In particular, they were experimenting with salts of radium-226. Later on, the French army took over these experiments, and they seriously contaminated the fort. In the 1990s, 61 barrels of cesium-137 and radium-226 were found stored there, as well as about 160,000 gallons of contaminated soil. Over the years, they have tried to decontaminate the area, but in 2006, more contaminated areas were uncovered. People in the area were being exposed to radioactivity and they didn't even know it. In fact, a high percentage of people living in the surrounding area were found to have cancer. Although they deny that this site has anything to do with it, it seems quite obvious that it does. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with ENEWETAK Island. This island is part of the Marshall Islands in the Pacific Ocean. In 1946 up until 1958, the US government conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. In 1951, the first ever hydrogen bomb was tested there. As a result, a number of atolls got contaminated, including ENEWETAK. In fact, it's said that the Marshall Islands to this day are still more radioactive than Chernobyl and Fukushima. Isn't that insane? So when testing the soil, researchers found that the island had toxic levels 10 to 1,000 times higher than the soil in Fukushima, and it's about 10 times more toxic than the soil found in Chernobyl. On top of that, the government said that this is a cause for great concern. The US government had to relocate an entire population because it was exposing them to cancer and other illnesses due to the radiation. But people still live there despite this huge concern. In 1980, hundreds of people gathered on this island and participated in a radioactive cleanup, but still, the levels on this island are highly unsafe. Coming in at number 4, we have RONGELAP Atoll. Surprise, surprise, another dangerously radioactive atoll located on the Marshall Islands. Researchers have found that this island has the highest levels of external gamma radiation than all of the islands they examined in the study. Soil samples from the area also exposed that they have high concentrations of radioactive isotopes. Not only that, but researchers also found that the fruits on the islands contained more cesium-137 than is permitted by safety standards. And some of the islands also contained more cesium-137 than Chernobyl ever had. In our 3rd spot today, we have Sellafield, United Kingdom. This is another place that has been given the name one of the world's most radioactive places. Back in the day, during the Cold War, Sellafield was the site where weapon-grade nuclear material materials were produced for the UK's nuclear weapon program. However, in 1957, one of the wind scale pipes caught on fire and 11 tons of uranium was on fire for 3 days. As a result, radioactive material started spreading across the Lake District. It was deemed Britain's worst nuclear accident. On top of that, no one evacuated and no one received iodine pills. In fact, some people didn't even know about the fire. They tried to keep it all hush-hush, and workers were just told to keep on working. That was until they found that golf courses, milk, and chickens, among other things, were getting contaminated. To this day, the plant releases around 2.3 million gallons of contaminated waste into the sea on a daily basis. In fact, this has made the Irish Sea the most radioactive sea in the world. Moving on to number 2, we have the Siberian Chemical Combine. This is another place contaminated by high levels of radiation. Located in Russia, this was one of the production facilities used to produce nuclear products for the Soviet nuclear weapons program. But after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the facility stopped its production of plutonium and uranium. But to this day, this combine keeps on contaminating underground waters. This has to do with the explosion that took place on April 6, 1993. As a result of the explosion, tens of thousands of people were exposed to high levels of radiation and contaminated air, water, and soil. In fact, it's said that 10 grams of plutonium is released into the atmosphere there each year. In 2008, a study of the area found increased levels of plutonium and cesium-137 in soils and water samples, suggesting the plant is still leaking. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the Bikini Atoll. This is another atoll located in the Marshall Islands. Turns out that depending on how long you stay there, you could get exposed to as much radiation as you would get from 1 to 64 chest x-rays. That's insane. So in 1954, this area was the site for the US's largest hydrogen bomb test. The blast from this bomb was thousands of times more powerful as the bombs dropped on Japan during World War II. As a result, Bikini Island is said to have the highest levels of radiation in all of the Marshall Islands. In fact, in 1946, residents were forced to relocate, so they were actually shipped around to a number of different islands. They kept moving these people around because of lack of water and food sources. Then in the 1960s, the government said that the islands were safe to live on again, and they were no longer radioactive, which was not the case, and they soon found the levels of radiation were still dangerously high, so everyone had to leave again. In fact, this location is said to be more radioactive than Chernobyl and Fukushima.